The fire spread fast. Dry grass crackled under hooves as Luke threw himself between the flames and his dying cattle. Because without water, his whole town would perish. Today, At Kindness Audio brings you a true-to-life story about a young cowboy named Luke, who risked everything to protect the only water source left during a deadly drought. But when greed and power threatened to steal that lifeline, would justice survive the heat? A dry gust swept across the open plains, lifting a veil of red dust that settled on Storm's leather reins. Luke squinted against the sun as he patted the side of his horse's neck. The heat had come early this year, sharp and unforgiving, painting the sky in faded hues and draining life from the land. Storm let out a low snort. Luke could tell the horse was thirsty, just like the cattle trailing behind, their heads low, their flanks rising and falling under the strain of the walk. "Just a bit more," Luke murmured, his voice calm but tight. The small basin near the base of Hollow Ridge had always held enough water to last through late summer. But as Luke guided the herd down the gentle slope toward the familiar pond, he could already see it. Mud cracked at the edges, a shallow pool in the middle, the water dark and still. The kind of water that stirred concern more than it quenched thirst. He dismounted, boots crunching on brittle grass, and stepped to the edge. Storm followed close, dipping his nose hesitantly into the murky puddle. The cattle lined up behind him, one by one stepping into the basin, kicking up silt as they drank what little was left. Luke pulled off his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow. His father's words echoed in his head, "Keep the water, keep life." That had been his rule, spoken in times when the land was kind and the rains still came on time. But this year, everything was different. A creaking wheel and the clatter of a bucket signaled another presence. Martha Lee, from the neighboring ranch, was making her slow way down the slope. She balanced a wooden yoke across her shoulders, with 2 empty tin pails hanging from each side. "Well now," she said, her voice dry but warm. "Looks like you got here first, Luke." He turned, tipping his hat in greeting. "Morning, Miss Martha. Water's about gone." She surveyed the cattle and nodded slowly. "I figured. Mine haven't had a full drink in 2 days." Luke took one of her buckets and knelt by the pool, scooping carefully to avoid the sludge at the bottom. "Ain't gonna last much longer." "No," she said softly, "and if the rumors are true, it may be gone for good." Luke looked up. "Rumors?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Clara mentioned something this morning over at the diner. Harkins has been sniffing around the county water office. Word is, he's looking to claim the basin outright." Luke stiffened. Harkins owned the largest ranch this side of the ridge, and he had a long history of making things official once the land turned desperate. "He can't do that," Luke said, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, Martha or himself. She just shrugged. When a man owns 3 wells and half the cattle in the county, there's a lot he can do. That evening, Luke sat on the porch of the old house, the boards creaking beneath his boots. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the corral. He reached over and ran his fingers along the cracked leather of an old saddle leaning against the post, his father's saddle, worn by time and memory. It still smelled faintly of sweat and sun and sagebrush. In the stillness, a distant sound pierced the calm. Storm, who had been dozing near the barn, snapped his head up and let out a sharp whinny. His ears stood alert, and he pawed at the ground. Luke stood, listening. There, just faintly, the rhythmic beat of hooves. Not fast, not slow, circling the basin. He stepped down from the porch, heart tightening in his chest. Someone was out there, someone who didn't want to be seen. Moonlight spilled faintly across the dried grass, casting long, wavering shadows at the water's edge. Luke crouched beside a small campfire, poking the glowing embers with a stick, watching the sparks swirl upward before dissolving into the thick summer night. The heat hadn't eased, even after the sun dipped. It wrapped around him like a damp blanket, made heavier by the silence that wasn't quite still. Storm stood a few yards off, tethered loosely to a post, ears flicking in agitation. The horse pawed the earth twice, then snorted, as if sensing something was off. Luke didn't blame him. Across the basin, a figure moved, then another. Silhouettes blurred in the dusty moonlight, drifting out from the darkness near the ridge and into view. 3 of them, maybe 4, walking slow and wide like they owned the place. The leader stepped forward first, tall and lean, with a swagger that made Luke's jaw clench before a word was said. "Evenin'," came the slow drawl. "Didn't expect company at this hour." Luke stood, hands loose at his sides, but every muscle taut. "Neither did I." Roy Barker grinned, teeth gleaming even in the low light. "Figured I'd take a stroll down to the basin, see how the water's holding up." Luke didn't move. "That your idea of a stroll? Bring in 3 men and no horses?" Roy chuckled low, the sound thin and oily. "Didn't want to wake the neighbors with hoofbeats. You seem to be the only one awake anyhow." Luke's eyes flicked toward the shadowy figures flanking Roy. He recognized one of them, Wes, a rough hand from the Harkins ranch, always with too much grin and too little patience. The other 2 were unfamiliar, but their stance told him all he needed to know. Hired muscle. "I came to water my herd," Luke said, voice steady. "Same as I've done since I could ride." Roy nodded, stepping a little closer, hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn duster. Sure. You got history here, but history don't always stand up to paperwork now, does it?" Luke felt the blood tighten in his veins. "There ain't no paperwork says you own this. Not yet," Roy said, with a smirk that curled cruel at the edges. "But the boss is making moves. Fast ones." The 2 men stared at each other, the fire crackling between them. "Why don't you pack up?" Roy continued. "Head on back to your little ranch and leave this mess to folks with bigger plans." Luke didn't answer. He didn't need to. After a long silence, Roy gave a mock sigh and turned. "Suit yourself. But I'd keep my boots on at night if I were you." They walked off without another word, disappearing into the dark like shadows retreating from a flame. The wind kicked up dust as they left, and Luke stood motionless until their silhouettes melted completely into the hills. Storm neighed suddenly, loud and sharp, pulling at the rope. Luke turned to calm him, but paused. His eyes caught something glinting in the low firelight near the far end of the basin. He walked slowly toward it, boots crunching on brittle earth. There, half hidden in the grass and driven deep into the soil, stood a new wooden stake. He knelt beside it. The wood was fresh, the edge splintered slightly, the top marked crudely with red paint. It hadn't been there the day before. Luke reached out and brushed the dust away from its base. Around it, the ground bore signs of a scuffle, dried hoofprints, boots, and one set of horseshoe marks, clean and deliberate, leading northward. Straight toward the Harkins spread, he stood up slowly, jaw clenched, and looked out over the water. The reflection of the moon shimmered across the broken surface. His fingers closed around the top of the stake, the red paint staining his skin. "They've started," he whispered, his voice low but sharp. Behind him, Storm stomped again, eyes fixed toward the trees. Something had shifted. The war for water had begun. The warm, sweet smell of roasted corn drifted through the air, wrapping around the old wooden porch like an invisible ribbon. Luke leaned back in the creaking chair, his boots tapping softly against the floorboards. From inside, the clinking of dishes and the hum of Martha's voice moved like a lullaby through the screen door. She emerged a moment later, wiping her hands on a faded cloth, carrying a plate stacked with golden cornbread still steaming. "Still comes out better when it's slow-baked," she said, setting the plate on the table between them. "Your daddy used to say you can't rush flavor or forgiveness." Luke smiled faintly, the kind that came not from happiness, but recognition. The porch faced west, where the sun hovered low, casting long rays across the dry field. It hadn't rained in weeks. The earth cracked like porcelain left too long in the sun. But here, for a moment, the warmth wasn't just from the heat, it was from memory. Martha poured cold lemonade into 2 old glass tumblers, the kind etched with tiny vines along the rim. "I remember a summer like this," she said, sliding one glass toward Luke. 30 years back. We thought the land would break before the people did." Luke took a sip, savoring the citrus tang. "You made it through." She nodded slowly. "Barely, but not before the town split down the middle. Friends stopped speaking. Folks started selling, all over water." The screen door creaked again, and Samuel Torres stepped onto the porch. His shirt stuck to his back with sweat, and his eyes scanned the horizon like he was looking for something that might save them all. "I heard about the stake," he said, not sitting. Luke nodded. Roy Barker didn't hide what he came for. Samuel rubbed the back of his neck. "Harkins has money, legal teams, influence. Maybe it's time to think practical." Martha's hand froze over the napkin she was folding. "Practical?" Luke asked. "Yeah. You keep fighting, you'll lose everything. I'm not saying you like it. I'm saying it's how things go." Luke stood slowly, chair scraping against the porch. "My father died plowing this land, keeping the herd going through drought and flood. He didn't bow his head for easier winters. And I won't either." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Stubbornness isn't courage, Luke." "No," Luke said calmly. "But compromise ain't always peace either." The silence that followed was thick, the kind of silence that didn't come from lack of words, but too many left unsaid. Samuel exhaled, glanced once at Martha, and turned back toward the dusty road. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "But don't expect the town to burn with you." The screen door slapped shut behind him. Martha cleared her throat and stood, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the 2 glasses. "He's not a bad man," she said. "Just scared. Scared like the rest of us." Luke nodded, watching the trail of dust Samuel left in his wake. "Fear's understandable, but fear doesn't get to stake my land." Martha didn't answer. She turned instead, walked to the small sink inside, and began washing the glasses. The light caught one of them just so, etched vines dancing with the sunlight, and for a second her face softened. "This town," she said quietly, "this town used to be one thing. Then the water went dry and it became another." Luke stepped down from the porch, gaze falling on the herd just beyond the fence. The cattle moved slow, their ribs more visible than they should have been, noses brushing the dirt for anything green. He gripped the fence rail. Storm, tied nearby, whinnied low, as if sensing the resolve gathering in his rider. Luke's eyes didn't leave the cattle. "I won't let them starve. I won't let this place fall apart again." Behind him, Martha's voice, barely a whisper, floated out the window. "Water once tore this town in 2. Luke's jaw tightened, but this time, he vowed, it wouldn't happen without a fight. The midday sun poured down like fire, turning the dirt road to dust and casting everything in a shimmer of heat. Luke stood by the gate of the Morgan Ranch, one hand resting on the worn cedar post, his eyes narrowed against the glare. In the distance, a white plume of dust rose, rising like smoke from the earth. The rhythm of hooves grew louder, strong, steady, familiar. Storm, tied nearby under the sliver of shade, lifted his head and gave a sharp, spirited whinny. Luke stepped forward instinctively. He knew that sound. Storm remembered something. Someone. A few moments later, the rider burst through the haze. A lean figure on a chestnut mare, hat pulled low, dust on his boots and sweat on his brow. When the rider saw Luke, he pulled the reins hard. The horse slowed, skidded to a stop in front of the gate, and the man swung down in one fluid motion. "Luke Morgan," the stranger said, a grin cracking through the grit on his face. Luke's eyes widened, then softened. "Ethan Cooper, you son of a gun." They embraced like brothers, like boys who once thought they'd rule the world from the back of a horse. "Been years," Ethan said, patting Storm's neck. "But that stallion still remembers me, huh?" "He don't forget easily," Luke replied, clapping his friend on the back. They settled under the awning near the barn, dust still clinging to their clothes. Luke poured 2 tin cups of warm water from the jug, and Ethan drank like a man who hadn't tasted home in months. "I heard about the drought," Ethan said, eyes scanning the brittle pasture, "and about Harkins sniffing around. Figured I'd best come before you ran out of friends and water." Luke chuckled dryly. "Well, you're not wrong. The lake's drying faster than the town's patience." Ethan leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Grew up around dry land, remember? You watch the wind. When it shifts like it has lately, it means this drought ain't leaving soon." He pulled out a folded scrap of paper from his saddlebag, an old map marked with ink and dirt. "There's a dried creek bed 2 miles west. Might still be water underneath, if we dig smart." Luke looked at the map, nodding slowly. "You sure about this?" "As sure as I am that your herd won't make it another week on dust and memories." They spent the next few hours walking the lines of old fencing, checking busted troughs and shaded spots where moisture might cling to the earth. Ethan's experience and sharp eyes were a gift. He showed Luke how to listen for the hollow shift in ground, the smell of deeper damp, the tilt of dry grass leaning toward buried moisture. As they reached the northern edge of the property, a lazy wind carried the faint sound of horses. Luke tensed. From behind a crooked mesquite, Roy Barker appeared on horseback, his wide hat casting a shadow over his smirking face. He was alone, but the arrogance in his posture made it clear he didn't feel outnumbered. "Well, look who's dragged in an old friend," Roy said, eyeing Ethan. "Planning a last supper before your cows keel over?" Ethan didn't blink. He stepped forward with an easy swagger, tipping his hat in mock politeness. "We were just talking about how quiet things have been without coyotes sniffing around." Roy's grin twitched. "Keep patching that land, Morgan. All the buckets in the county won't help when that spring's gone." Luke stared straight at him. "Then you'd best stop wasting your own water running your mouth." Roy's smile vanished. He turned his horse and rode off without another word, hooves scattering loose stones behind him. The silence returned with the dust. Ethan turned to Luke. "He's pressing." "Trying to get in your head," Luke nodded. "He's already staked claims. Next he'll try buying the rest of the town." "Well," Ethan said, pulling a dried loaf of bread from his pack, breaking it in 2. "Good thing we've been broke before." They sat on a flat rock, sharing the bread like they did as teenagers on cattle drives long gone. No butter, no spread, just dry crusts and shared stories. "Remember that week in Cimarron?" Ethan said between bites. "Horse threw me in the river. You fished me out and stole my boots," Luke laughed. "You were bragging you could ride bareback blindfolded." "I just helped you live up to it." The laughter lingered. a rare echo of simpler days. As the sun dipped low, casting amber streaks across the parched land, Storm stamped his hoof, snorted once, and turned his head toward the setting light. Ethan stood, brushing crumbs from his shirt. Whatever's coming, they'll have to deal with both of us now. Luke rose too, eyes fixed on the horizon, and this time, he didn't feel alone. The sky bled orange as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long, crooked shadows across the brittle land. The prairie stretched wide and golden, but there was no beauty in it that evening, only tension thick as the heat still clinging to the dust. Luke wiped his brow with the back of his hand and scanned the horizon. "Something doesn't feel right," he muttered, adjusting his hat. Ethan, crouched near a rusted water trough they'd rigged from salvaged tin sheets, glanced up. "You feel it too?" Storm lifted his head and let out a low, uneasy snort. A faint smell teased the edge of the breeze. Smoke. Luke's eyes narrowed toward the far fence line. There, in the fading light, wisps of gray curled upward from the dry grass. Within seconds, the smoke thickened, twisting into the sky like a serpent uncoiling. "Fire!" Luke shouted. They took off running, boots pounding the cracked earth. By the time they reached the field, orange tongues of flame were already racing across the grass, fed by weeks of drought and the dry prairie wind. From the other side of the fence, Roy Barker sat tall on his horse, flanked by two riders. His posture casual, too casual for a man who'd just stumbled on disaster. "Well now," he called out, voice oily and smug. "Reckon the heat's picking up." "You light this?" Ethan growled, already pulling his shirt over his face as he dashed toward the fire line. Roy shrugged. "Just clearing brush." Must have caught a little too well. The wind shifted and suddenly the fire jumped, a flash of heat leaping the trench, flames biting into the wooden fence. Luke and Ethan slapped at the fire with burlap sacks, desperate to stop it from spreading toward the corral. "Water!" Luke called out, voice hoarse. A figure appeared, sprinting from the edge of the property. Clara, skirt tied up, a heavy tin bucket swinging in each hand. She didn't speak, just dumped the water straight into the path of the flames, then ran back for more. But the fire had already taken a toll. With a loud crack, a section of the old fence gave way. Sparks rained down as the wood collapsed, opening a wide gap. The cattle, already nervous, panicked. They surged toward the opening, hooves thundering, eyes wide with fear. "Luke!" Ethan shouted. "The herd!" Luke didn't hesitate. He threw himself into their path, waving his arms, yelling, trying to steer them away from the flames. One steer broke toward him, wild-eyed. Ethan grabbed a long stick and slammed it against a trough. The noise loud enough to startle the beast, just enough to swerve. Luke stumbled, barely avoiding the hooves. He landed hard on the dirt, coughing from the smoke, but the cattle slowed, confused by the chaos and Ethan's noise. "Back!" "Get back!" Ethan shouted, swinging the stick wide. Clara ran to Luke, helped him to his feet. His arm was scraped, his shirt singed, but he was still breathing. They stood together, panting, as the last of the fire flickered out under their efforts. Smoke hung low over the field like a bitter veil. The scorched grass still smoldered in patches, the air heavy with ash. Across the ruined fence line, Roy watched from horseback, his grin returning slowly. "Now that," he said, voice low and smug, "was just the beginning." He tipped his hat and rode off, his men behind him. Luke didn't answer. His gaze followed Roy until the dust swallowed them whole. Later that night, under the dim light of the barn lantern, Luke and Ethan worked in silence. They hammered rusted sheets of tin onto wooden frames, angling them just right. "Rain's still a chance," Ethan said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Even a short burst would fill these fast." Luke nodded, tightening the last bolt. "A little hope's better than none." They stood back, looking at their crude contraption. Rain catchers, old and bent, but ready. From outside, Clara's voice called softly, "Coffee's on, if you boys aren't too proud." Ethan smiled. "We're just stubborn enough." Luke didn't smile, not quite. His eyes drifted toward the blackened field, the broken fence, the distant echo of Roy's words. But his voice was steady when he said, "Let him think we're losing." He turned back to the troughs, hands busy, mind sharper than ever. Because this wasn't the end. It was just a spark. The church bell rang out across the dusty rooftops, its clear notes rolling over the hills like a morning breeze. It was the signal everyone had been waiting for, the start of the summer fair. Main Street came alive with colors and laughter. Booths were raised, pies arranged, ribbons fluttering on fences and hats alike. The scent of baked apples and cinnamon wafted through the square, mingling with the sound of a fiddle warming up on a small wooden stage. Luke arrived in his best shirt, still plain but freshly washed, and gave a nod to the old-timers whittling by the well. Ethan was already at the edge of the crowd, chewing on a roasted ear of corn and calling out greetings like he'd never been gone. Clara stood by the lemonade stand, her hair swept back and a simple blue dress catching in the wind. She wasn't looking for attention, but her eyes searched the crowd until they landed on Luke. She smiled, quick and soft, and Luke, who could face a charging steer without flinching, suddenly forgot how to breathe right. He walked over. "Didn't think you'd come," she said. "Didn't think I'd see you in that dress," he answered, then cleared his throat, unsure where that boldness had come from. Clara looked away, but the color in her cheeks deepened. "It's nothing special." "It is," he said simply. The fairground filled with games and laughter. Kids raced with burlap sacks, dogs barked at balloon animals, and a band of fiddlers struck up a rowdy tune near the courthouse steps. Ethan slapped Luke on the back. "You signed up for the bronc ride?" Luke raised a brow, not planning to break a rib today. "Come on," Ethan grinned. "You're the closest thing we got to a real cowboy." Soon enough, Luke found himself on a snorting gelding in the middle of a ring marked by hay bales. The crowd whooped as he held on through each buck, hat flying off, dust swirling. Clara cheered quietly at first, then clapped with a hand over her mouth as he finally dismounted, boots hitting dirt with a satisfying thud. "I feel better when I see you ride like that," she whispered to him later, eyes still shining. "Like you can handle anything." Luke looked at her, really looked, and something softened behind his usual stillness. "Maybe I can," he said. But not all eyes in town were so warm. Roy Barker leaned against the cider stall, a lazy smile playing under his mustache. He didn't shout or stomp. He just spoke low to the men passing by. "Word is, folks siding with Harkins'll get first crack at the new well. Man's got plans, knows how to handle Drought, knows who to take care of." By sunset, the whisper had traveled far and fast. Farmers exchanged looks, wives drew close. The fair's cheer thinned like a song drifting off key. Clara stood near the town notice board, a clipboard in her hand. She'd been planning it for weeks, a water schedule, fair and rotating, so every family could draw from the reservoir in order. She pinned it up with a firm hand. "This is what we agreed on," she said aloud, voice clear. "Equal turns." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ethan stepped beside her, arms crossed. "Unless some folks think fairness don't apply no more." A few men shuffled their feet. One woman whispered to another. The music played on, but the warmth in the air had cooled. Roy stepped forward, arms wide like he was just stretching. "Sure, Clara. Fair's nice. But what if fair means everyone suffers together, instead of some of us getting ahead?" Clara didn't flinch. "That's not getting ahead, Roy. That's selling each other out." Luke stepped up next to her then, silent but steady. He didn't need to say much. His presence was enough. Clara met the crowd's eyes once more. "Don't let them divide us," she said, her voice low but firm. "We've been through worse." But only when we stood together. The fiddlers began a slow reel, unsure whether to keep playing. A child laughed somewhere, chasing a dog near the beg table. The fair went on, hesitant, wobbled, but still standing. Later, as lanterns flickered and the stars pressed close, Luke walked Clara back to her porch. She leaned on the railing, quiet for a moment. "Do you think they'll hold to it?" she asked. "Some will," he replied. "Some won't." "But enough?" she whispered. Luke looked out over the town, glowing faint in the dark. "We'll find out," he said. The morning after the fair brought no peace. Heavy clouds gathered in the sky like a warning, and the wind kicked up dust until it painted the horizon a dull red. Even the windmill behind the Morgan barn creaked with unease, its blades spinning half-heartedly in the dry gusts. Storm stood restless in the corral, ears flicking back, his dark mane rippling in the breeze. He let out a high, sharp whinny that echoed off the hills. Luke looked up from the empty rain barrels lined along the fence. Not a drop had fallen all week. "That horse knows something," Ethan muttered, standing by the gate with his arms folded. Luke saddled up slowly. "He always does." They hadn't gone more than a mile down the dirt road skirting the lake when they saw them. 3 riders silhouetted against the steel-gray sky. The lead horse was tall, well-groomed, and carried a man who didn't belong to dust and sweat like the rest of them. Harkins. He wore a tailored vest under his long coat, boots that still shined despite the road. On either side of him rode Roy Barker and a younger man with a sneer too practiced for someone his age. Luke pulled Storm to a halt. Ethan stopped just behind him. "Well, well," Harkins called out, smiling like a man greeting old friends. "Didn't expect to see the Morgan boys out so early. You blocking the road or just posing?" Ethan shot back. Harkins chuckled. "Always the sharp tongue." Luke said nothing. His eyes didn't leave Harkins. The older man dismounted with deliberate slowness. Dust clouded around his boots, but he didn't seem to notice or care. "I thought it was time we had a civilized talk," he said, pulling a small envelope from inside his coat. "The drought's no secret, and as much as we all enjoy your idealism, Luke, water management isn't about sentiment. It's about structure." He handed the envelope to Luke. Luke didn't take it. "What is it?" he asked flatly. "A letter," Harkins said smoothly, "from the county council. A request, really. They'd like to meet, evaluate water usage, reassign rights if needed. Legal process. Nothing personal." Roy leaned on his saddle horn. "Fair's fair, right?" Luke finally took the envelope. The seal was clean, pressed deep in red wax. It felt heavier than it should. Ethan stepped forward. "And who asked for this evaluation? Let me guess. It wasn't Martha Lee or the Harpers down by the ridge." Harkins tilted his head. "Let's not play games, gentlemen. The land's changing, the weather's turning, and the people want stability. Or they want a tyrant who promises water in exchange for silence, Ethan said. The younger man shifted in his saddle, clearly itching for a fight, but a quick look from Harkins held him back. I'm not the villain here, Harkins said, soft. Just a man with vision and a few more friends in Austin than you two. He remounted with grace, his horse barely stirring. I suggest you show up on time, he said. They're coming next week. Then they turned, and just like that, the trio rode off, the dust of their departure swirling back into Luke's face. For a long moment, no one said a word. Then Ethan spoke, voice low. Well, that just made things official. Luke looked down at the sealed envelope. He could feel the weight of it in his palm, the shape of something final. They want to make it law, he said, to take what's left and call it fair. The wind picked up again, sharper now, pulling at the ends of his shirt. The broken windmill behind them gave a long, painful squeal as it turned once, then stopped. Storm stomped a hoof, restless, as if waiting for Luke to say what came next. But Luke just stared down the road where Harkins had gone, because the war for water had just taken its first legal breath. The sun hit hard that morning, blazing straight down on the dry lake bed, like it meant to burn away the last thread of hope. The air shimmered with heat, and from across the cracked plain came the sound of the cattle, low, hoarse bawling that told of thirst too deep for words. Luke wiped sweat from his brow as he stood by the edge of the old basin. Storm's tail flicked against the dust, restless. The herd had gathered near the mangled fence line, their ribs sharp under stretched hides, tongues lolling as they waited for something that wasn't coming. Ethan knelt by the patch of scorched earth where they'd set up the rain catchers. His fingers traced the splintered edge of the wood and bent sheet metal. Luke stepped up behind him. They're gone, Ethan said quietly. The whole thing. Every damn piece. The trough they'd built from old tin and barn scraps. Gone. Water barrels tipped over, punctured. Dry. Even the buckets had vanished. Luke didn't answer. He didn't need to. Martha arrived soon after, her pace slower than usual, skirt brushing the dust. Clara helped her over a patch of broken fence, careful hands guiding the older woman toward the shade of the half-collapsed lean-to. It's all gone? Martha asked, voice trembling. Luke gave a small nod. Behind them, more cattle called out, the sound like sandpaper scraping over bone. Samuel Torres approached, arms crossed, face drawn tight. We should have known, he muttered. You poke a snake, don't be surprised when it bites. Luke turned. You saying we should have just rolled over? Samuel didn't meet his eyes. I'm saying maybe it's time we stop playing hero. Let Harkins handle it. He's got trucks, wells, folks lined up to help him. He's got control, Ethan snapped. That's all he wants. Control, not community. Clara stepped between them, voice calm but firm. We need each other more than we need him. Samuel shook his head, rubbing the back of his neck. You're too young to know what happens when you stand in the way of a man like that. Clara squared her shoulders. And you're too old to remember what it means to fight for what's right. There was a silence then, heavy with dust and heat, and everything left unsaid. Martha sat on a rock, her hands clutching a small wooden rosary worn smooth by years of prayers. She whispered softly, beads sliding through her fingers as the cattle cried behind her. Luke walked slowly toward what was left of the trough. Just a patch of ground darker than the rest, a few nails glinting under the sun. His boots crunched over cracked dirt. He bent, picked up a shard of the broken rain pan, and held it in his hand like a question. We built that with scraps, Ethan said from behind him. You and me. under the stars. Luke didn't look back. We'll build another. With what? Luke turned his gaze to the north, toward the rise where Harkins's ranch sat quiet and gleaming under the morning light. This isn't over, he said. They want us to break. But I'm not broken. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the field. We're going to find another way. Clara stepped up beside him. Then I'll stand with you. Ethan nodded. So will I. Even Samuel didn't speak. Martha looked up from her prayer, eyes tired but steady. I've seen this land thirsty before, she said, but I've never seen it lose its heart. Don't let it start now. The wind stirred faintly, lifting the dust in lazy spirals. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried out. Luke clenched the metal shard in his hand and narrowed his eyes at the horizon. The fight wasn't finished. Not yet. By midday, the heat bore down like judgment. The sun sat high and cruel over the Texas plains, baking the cracked earth until it gave off waves of dry, shimmering haze. Dust swept across the lake bed in thick gusts, swirling around boots, hooves, and tense voices. Luke stood with Ethan at the south edge of the lake. Storm pawed the dirt beside them, uneasy. A sudden clanging drew their attention, metal hammering on metal, followed by rough shouting. From across the ridge came Roy Barker, flanked by 4 riders and a flatbed cart hauling fence posts, barbed wire, and wooden boards. Behind them, a sign jutted from the back of a mule, its red lettering glaring under the sun. Property of Harkins. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Roy wore a smirk beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Afternoon, boys, he called, voice oily. Just making it official. Luke stepped forward. You don't own this lake, Roy. Roy shrugged. Don't need to. Harkins has paperwork, just like the sign says. Ethan snorted. Paperwork don't mean squat if it's fake. Roy didn't flinch. He nodded toward his men who began hammering stakes into the dry ground, unraveling barbed wire in long silver coils. The air buzzed with tension as more ranchers arrived, drawn by the noise. Clara showed up on foot, shielding her eyes with a gloved hand. Behind her trailed a few of the town's herders, Mr. Greaves, the Yanez brothers, Old Man Harper. Their eyes bounced from the fence to the sign, to Luke. This ain't right, someone muttered. Can he really do that? Roy turned toward the crowd. It's legal, friends. County records will back it soon enough. Best to fall in line now. Harkins offers security, fair water rotation, and peace. Ain't that better than drought and chaos? The murmurs deepened. A few folks began backing away, glancing at one another with unease. Luke stepped beside the sign, ran his hand over the wood. The paint was still fresh. The font clumsy, too perfect to be official. He looked out at the crowd. There's no county seal, no signature, no case number. This ain't law. It's intimidation. But what if he's got the council on his side? Mr. Greaves asked, voice weary. What if he does make it law? Then we fight it fair, at the hearing, Luke said. We bring the real documents. We speak truth. But truth don't always win, one of the Yanez brothers said. Ethan stepped forward, eyes burning. Maybe not, but giving up guarantees we lose. Just then, the cattle, hot, confused, and thirsty, pressed against the freshly built fence. One cow bleated loud, pushing through the wire, snapping a post in half. The others surged forward, driven by instinct more than fear. The fence gave way in spots, sending Roy's men scrambling to regain control. Get 'em back, Roy barked, before they wreck the whole damn line. The animals trampled the sign, knocking it crooked into the dust. Luke grabbed Storm's reins and held steady as chaos unfolded. Men yelling, hooves pounding, wire snapping under pressure. Finally, things settled. The cattle had pushed their way toward the dry basin, noses searching the cracked mud for moisture. A silence fell, broken only by the distant hum of cicadas. Roy straightened his hat, face red. "This ain't over." "No," Luke said. "It's just starting." As Roy turned and rode off, Clara joined Luke and Ethan. Her face was flushed with heat and fury. "They're splitting us," she said quietly. "Making neighbors question neighbors." Luke nodded. "That's the plan. If we turn on each other, they win." Behind them, more ranchers lingered, some thoughtful, some uncertain. The division was real now, not just in fence posts or ink, but in hearts. Ethan looked at Luke, jaw tight. "If we back down today," he said, voice low, "we lose more than land. We lose everything." The sharp clang of a shovel striking dry earth broke the stillness of morning. Each hit sent small clouds of dust into the air, hanging like a veil over the clay-blistered plain. The sun wasn't yet at its peak, but already the air shimmered with heat. Samuel wiped the back of his hand across his forehead, smearing dirt into sweat. His eyes, though weary, remained fixed on the hole before him. "Keep digging," he barked hoarsely. His voice cracked, not just from thirst, but from something deeper, stubbornness born of pride. Two men beside him, a wiry old rancher named Dell, and a younger fellow with a straw hat too big for his face, glanced at each other, but obeyed. The hole was already chest deep, but still, only dust and dry rock came up with every shovel. "This clay's dead," Dell muttered. "Ain't no water down here, Sam." Samuel didn't respond. He stabbed his shovel back into the pit, flinging out another scoop. Behind them, the cracked expanse of land stretched toward the horizon, silent except for the labored breathing of those still willing to work. "Maybe we should head back," the younger man said. "This ain't the place." Harkins said the map. "Maps lie," Samuel cut in, panting. "Water doesn't. It's gotta be here," but the soil said otherwise. Every inch deeper only revealed more of the same, parched, lifeless dirt. No sign of moisture, no scent of damp clay. An hour passed, then another. The sun climbed, merciless. The younger man dropped his shovel. "I'm out. My hands are blistered and this ain't work. It's punishment." Dell followed suit, easing his back upright with a groan. "You keep at it if you want, Samuel, but I ain't busting myself for a dream in the dust." The two men walked off, slow and hunched. Samuel barely looked up. He kept digging. Luke appeared just past midday, riding Storm along the ridge. He stopped a few yards from the hole, dismounted quietly, and watched. Samuel didn't greet him. The sound of the shovel had slowed, the blows weaker now, more spaced apart. Finally, Samuel dropped to his knees, breathing ragged. He stared into the pit he'd spent the morning carving. His fingers clawed into the dirt, brushing through dry grains that offered no relief. No trickle, no glimmer, just more emptiness. Luke approached without a word. He looked at the hole, then at Samuel, slumped and silent, shoulders caked with dirt and failure. Reaching into his saddlebag, Luke pulled out a tin flask. He set it gently on a flat rock near the edge of the pit. He didn't speak, just turned and walked back to Storm. Samuel didn't reach for the water right away. His eyes followed Luke as he mounted the horse, the creak of the saddle filling the silence between them. As Luke began to ride away, Samuel called out, not loudly, but enough to carry. I thought following Harkins would mean something, that he had a plan. Luke paused, but didn't turn around. Plans built on fear don't hold water, Samuel. Then he rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the dusty stillness. Samuel looked back into the pit. His own reflection stared back in the shadowed dirt, hollow, sunken, cracked. He reached for the flask, unscrewed the lid, and sipped, just enough to wet his throat. Then he turned, eyes scanning the horizon. Not toward the Harkins camp, but toward the lake. Night crept across the plains, casting long, heavy shadows over the Morgan ranch. The wind had picked up, hissing through the fence posts and loose wires, making the half-empty water tanks creak and groan. A lantern swayed on the front porch, its flame flickering against the wood. Luke stood under the porch light, a broad slab of old timber laid across two sawhorses. The board, once part of his father's barn, bore scratches from years past, now repurposed for something new. He dipped the stub of chalk into a bowl of ash to give it grip, then pressed it to the surface. Monday through Friday, he muttered, writing slowly. Families with less than 20 head get morning draws. Midday hours split evenly. Evenings reserved for community storage. Ethan leaned on the post nearby, watching. You really think they'll honor this? If we don't set the terms, Harkins will, Luke replied, not looking up. And his won't leave anything for folks like Martha. Clara stepped forward, holding a folded sheet in her hand. This is the rotation I made last week, based on need, not power. She smoothed it on the table, her handwriting small but firm. We've already been following it at the well near the chapel. Luke nodded, adjusting the layout on the board to make room. We merge it. Show unity. The three worked in silence for a while. The night deepened, moonlight washing over the dry pasture. Ethan stepped back and squinted at the board. We ought to add a clause, he said, about stormwater collection. Priority for those who contribute tanks and tools. Luke agreed, chalking the note into the corner. If you bring the tin, you share the rain. Meanwhile, Clara wandered to the edge of the porch, eyes on the newly installed rain trough. She ran a hand along its side, then bent down to shift the angle slightly. The slope's off, she murmured. Ethan joined her, kneeling beside the makeshift gutter. Too much westward tilt, he noted. We'll lose runoff in heavy wind. Together they adjusted it, anchoring the end with a rock slab. When they rose, Ethan clapped his hands free of dust. That'll hold. Clara turned to Luke, who was just stepping down from the porch with the finished board. We'll present it at the council hearing, he said, voice steady. This isn't just a list. It's a stand. Clara placed her hand gently on his shoulder. This isn't just about water, Luke. This is life itself. For all of us. He gave a slight nod, then tilted the board upright against a beam, letting the moonlight hit the names and notes. A sudden noise cracked the quiet. Hooves, fast, deliberate, and close. Ethan reached for the lantern and doused it in one motion. The porch fell into shadow. From the north end of the property came the sound of horses, several. Leather saddles creaked, a distant cough. The unmistakable sound of boots shifting in stirrups. Luke gestured toward the stable wall. The three moved silently behind the beam. Storm stirred inside the pen, letting out a short, nervous snort. Clara whispered, "They're watching." Luke didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the horizon. The hoofbeats circled once, then faded. Whoever it was, they weren't here to speak, only to remind. As silence returned, Luke moved back to the board, fingers tracing the names in chalk. "We'll put this up at dawn," he said. They all knew what that meant. The morning sun spilled over the horizon like molten gold, yet it did little to warm the chill riding on the wind. Dust curled into the air as Harkins and his men rode in, their silhouettes dark against the glowing sky. The hooves of a dozen horses pounded the dirt trail leading toward the lake, raising clouds that swallowed the light. Luke stood near the fence post, boots planted firm. Ethan and Clara flanked him, their eyes narrowing as Harkins approached, flanked by Roy Barker and several other hands. Clutched in Harkins's gloved hand was a stack of papers, thick and edged in red seals. "I figured it's about time we settle things properly," Harkins drawled, stopping just short of Luke. He raised the papers with a theatrical flourish. "Certified rights to the lake water, recognized by county seal." Some villagers had gathered behind Luke, murmuring nervously. Samuel stood at the edge of the crowd, his hand gripping the small water flask Luke had left for him days ago. Luke didn't flinch. "Those papers don't mean a damn thing until council says so." Roy sneered. "Council's a formality." "We came to let folks know what's coming." Ethan stepped forward. "You mean intimidation? This here's a scare tactic." Harkins raised an eyebrow. "Truth hurts more than threats, son." Clara took a deep breath. "Where was that seal filed?" "County clerk's office don't open till Tuesday." Roy barked a laugh. "Guess they made an exception for men with plans." Luke turned to the crowd. "This isn't legal." "It's printed paper with a stamp. Until the council reviews it, it holds no weight." A murmur of uncertainty swept through the villagers. Some looked toward Harkins, others to Luke. Tension stretched taut like a pulled rope. Roy stepped onto a nearby rock, waving a copy of the paper. "You want your herds dead of thirst? Or do you want assurance, structure, survival?" Ethan's jaw clenched. "You offer submission." Roy's voice grew louder. "We offer stability." This isn't just about Luke or Harkins. This is about choosing sides, about who's going to lead this town out of drought. Clara stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We already chose. We chose each other, but the damage had begun." The crowd rippled with disagreement, some voices raised, others shaking heads. A few peeled off quietly, walking away toward the east fields. Luke watched, chest tight. These were friends, neighbors, folks who shared meals, traded cattle, danced at the summer fair, now split by a few pieces of inked paper. Harkins let the silence linger before speaking low and cold. "Next council meeting, I'll bring witnesses, documents, facts, and I'll show them who's truly entitled." He turned his horse. "Until then, I suggest you all think hard about which side of history you want your name on." Roy gave the crowd one last glance before trotting after his boss, tossing a crumpled copy of the so-called decree onto the dry ground. The hooves faded, the dust settled, the silence remained. Samuel stood motionless. His eyes weren't on the retreating riders, they were fixed on Luke. He opened the flask slowly, took a sip, then capped it with trembling hands. Luke looked at the townsfolk still gathered. "We're not backing down." No one spoke, but a few nodded. They were bruised, but not broken. The church bell rang out, long and steady, its sound rippling across the dry air like a hymn of hope. From every corner of the valley, boots kicked up dust, wagons creaked forward, and tired eyes turned toward the lake. That morning, the clearing near the shore filled faster than ever before, not with anger or fear, but with purpose. Smoke curled gently from a makeshift fire pit where Martha Lee crouched, tending a heavy iron pot. Brisket simmered inside, its rich aroma dancing through the crowd like a memory long forgotten. Alongside her, cornbread sizzled in shallow pans, golden and fragrant. A line had already formed before she even lifted the lid. "You line up decent, you get fed," Martha called out with mock sternness, sweat beading on her brow, but eyes twinkling. "And if anyone tries to cut, I'll hand you the smallest slice." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Clara moved among the people, clipboard in hand. Morning water draw starts with the Thompsons and the Lius. After that, households with livestock over 15 head. Heads nodded. Murmurs of approval passed between neighbors. For the first time in weeks, the tension had eased, even if just for a while. Luke stood by the troughs with Ethan, watching as folks took turns, filled jugs, watered cattle without a single shout or scuffle. He scanned the horizon, half expecting Roy or Harkins to appear with more bluster. But the only dust cloud was from old wagons rolling in, not riders stirring trouble. Near the back of the line, Samuel approached. His clothes were still dusty, and his eyes carried the weight of stubborn pride. But when he reached Clara, he stopped and took off his hat. "I was wrong," he said plainly. "I'd like to help, if you'll have me." Clara didn't hesitate. "There's still stew left, and a few names need adding to the rotation list." She handed him a pencil, and he nodded, shoulders lowering just a bit. Martha called from the fire, "There's room at the fire too, boy." "Don't think I forgot how you liked your cornbread near burnt." Laughter rose again, and Samuel managed a half-smile as he stepped forward. The gathering swelled as more folks arrived, not just to draw water, but to help stack wood, mend broken crates, and share jars of homemade pickles or cold tea. Someone began playing a fiddle near the shade of a wagon, and soon a few children were dancing barefoot in the dirt. Then came the voices. Low at first, then louder. Cheers, claps, a chant building not from a single throat, but from dozens. "Fair water! Fair land!" Luke turned, startled. They weren't looking at him directly, but toward the handmade board now posted on a large oak stake. His board. The one with Clara's lists, Ethan's markings, and all their names scribbled in chalk and ash. He stepped back, letting the roar of unity rise without trying to claim it. At the edge of the clearing, Roy Barker watched, his jaw clenched, lips twitching with frustration. He leaned toward Harkins, who sat stiff atop his horse nearby, hands tight on the reins. "They're not scared of you anymore," Roy muttered under his breath. Harkins didn't reply. Not yet. The sun hung directly overhead, casting sharp shadows along the dry, cracked earth by the lake. The heat was unrelenting, but the people stood firm, lined in two distinct groups on either side of the open clearing. From the dusty road came the slow creak of wagon wheels and the heavy thud of hooves. The Water Council had arrived. 3 members dressed in weather-worn coats and wide-brimmed hats stepped down from the lead wagon. At their front walked Reverend Miles, a tall man with quiet dignity and a voice that always carried farther than expected when the truth needed hearing. Clara clutched a worn ledger tight to her chest. Luke gave her a short nod, then stepped forward. Across the way, Harkins dismounted, handing Roy a folder thick with paper. "We'll keep this civil," Reverend Miles said, raising one hand. "We've heard claims. Now we hear facts." Harkins was the first to speak. "These documents," he said, tapping the folder, "verify exclusive rights to the lake water. Filed, signed, and sealed. The town needs a single hand at the spout, not chaos." He handed the papers to the council. Roy crossed his arms, a smirk on his face as he scanned the crowd. Luke stepped forward next. He held no folder, only a single board, marked with chalk lines, names, and times. "This," Luke said, "is the agreement we've lived by for weeks. Every draw of water accounted for, every family represented. We didn't claim the lake, we shared it." He passed the board to the council, along with a photo taken by Clara. A post near the lake bearing a fake metal sign that read, "Property of Harkins." The letters were peeling, the weld marks fresh. "Those signs weren't here a month ago," Luke continued. "We dug up the cinder block still warm from torching. And the boundary markers? Moved at night." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reverend Miles handed the items to the council's recorder and turned to Harkins. "Your deeds were filed when?" Roy stepped forward, interrupting. 2 weeks ago, but we had plans drawn up long before." "Plans aren't law," one councilman interrupted. Harkins's jaw tightened. Sweat collected under his collar. Then came the voices. One by one, villagers spoke, not shouting, just calm, measured truth. "We saw Luke haul water to neighbors before filling his own trough. Clara's lists kept our cattle alive. Those signs were never there before." Even Samuel raised his voice. "We followed Harkins for fear, but fear's a poor compass." The council members exchanged glances. Their pens scratched notes with increasing urgency. Then the sky began to shift. From the west, clouds gathered fast, thick and gray. A dry wind whipped through the trees, stirring loose dust and fallen leaves. Ethan leaned toward Luke, voice just above the wind. "Even the heavens know who's right today." The council called for silence. Reverend Miles stepped forward once more, face somber. "We will review all evidence, but I will say this. When a community chooses fairness over force, that tells us more than any signature ever could." He turned, robe flapping as the wind grew wilder. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, and across the clearing Harkins said nothing, but his face had gone pale. A lightning bolt split the sky with a sound like the earth cracking open. For a second the world turned white. Then came the rain. At first, a single drop struck the edge of the empty trough, then another, and another, until the heavens gave way and the prairie was swallowed in a downpour. Thunder rolled over the plains, but no one ran for cover. Instead, the people cheered. Children jumped in puddles as water ran in rivulets down their backs. Old men held their hats to their chests. Women looked upward, mouths open, in disbelief. Martha clutched her shawl close, eyes blinking fast against the rain, and whispered, "Mercy has a sound." Luke stood still, face tilted toward the sky. The rain washed away the sweat, the dust, and the weeks of tension that had clung to his skin like a second coat. Behind him, the tin gutters and patched-together rain catchers he and Ethan had installed clanged as water poured into them. The barrels filled within minutes, sloshing at the rims. Near the lake, the cracked shore began to soften, and the water crept forward, first inches, then feet. The low spot where cattle once struggled to sip now shimmered with life. The herd didn't wait. As if some ancient instinct called to them, they rushed toward the lake, hooves churning mud, heads lowered to drink greedily. Their bellows echoed across the plains, not with fear this time, but with relief. Clara laughed through tears, her hands raised like she was catching the rain itself. "They'll live," she whispered. "They'll really live." Ethan stumbled back from the edge of the trough he'd just checked. "I've never seen anything fill that fast," he said. "It's like the sky's been saving it for us." The townsfolk gathered without needing to be called. They stood side by side in the storm, shoulder to shoulder, letting the rain baptize the broken ground and the broken trust between them. Then came the silence. Harkins, soaked to the bone, stood apart from his men. His once starched collar drooped, papers in his hands now little more than mush. Roy stood behind him, teeth clenched, fists trembling. But there was no power in his rage today. No one listened. The crowd had turned, not with violence, not with hatred, but with the quiet finality of people who had seen the truth for themselves. Harkins dropped his papers to the mud. He didn't say a word, just turned, mounted his horse, and rode off into the rain, his silhouette shrinking into the mist like a bad memory losing shape. Roy shouted something behind him, unintelligible over the roar of the storm, but even his voice was drowned out. Luke stepped forward, boots sinking into wet clay, and placed a steady hand on the main barrel as it overflowed. His fingers traced the edge of the trough, the same one he'd hammered together under the sun with Ethan's help. This wasn't just water, it was proof. Clara moved beside him, raindrops mixing with the tears on her cheeks. She reached for his arm. All that work, it meant something. Luke looked at her, then at the land, then to the skies, still pouring freely. His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in awe. It always did, he said. The community stood together, faces lifted, hands reaching for one another, not to fight, but to hold steady, and as thunder rumbled toward the east, the only sound left was laughter. The morning sun rose over the prairie like a warm promise. Golden light stretched across the land, catching on every droplet that clung to grass blades and fence posts. The lake, once a cracked basin of despair, now shimmered, full and alive, as if it had never known thirst. Luke stood on the edge of the Morgan Ranch, one hand resting on Storm's reins, the other tucked into his belt. He breathed deep. The air, for once, smelled of growth, not dust. Behind him, voices buzzed with purpose. The townsfolk had gathered, not for protest nor defense, but for unity. Under a broad canvas stretched between two old fence posts, Clara stood with a worn ledger in hand, its pages now filled with names, time slots, and agreements. The community had come together to form something new, the Water Sharing Council. No one had voted, no one needed to. Clara simply stepped up with her steady voice and even steadier hands, and the rest had followed. Ethan leaned against the side of the barn, arms crossed, watching the scene with a quiet grin. "You sure you're ready for this kind of peace?" he joked. Luke smirked. "Might take some getting used to." They stood in silence for a beat before Ethan pulled a rolled-up paper from his saddlebag and handed it over. "This here's the map I promised. Old river beds, natural mounds, runoff directions. Should help when things get dry again." Luke nodded, taking the paper with both hands. "You're leaving?" Ethan patted Storm's flank and looked out toward the hills. "There's a ranch up north needs fencing. Thought I'd lend a hand before winter sets in." "No more troublemakers to chase off?" Luke asked, half teasing. Ethan shrugged. "For now." They shook hands the way men do when words fall short. Then Ethan swung up onto his horse and tipped his hat toward Clara and Martha before trotting off into the morning sun. By mid-morning, children were splashing at the lake's edge, and the troughs brimmed with clean water. Martha passed out cornbread and fresh peaches, humming an old hymn as she moved from group to group. Samuel approached quietly, holding the tin water bottle Luke had left him days before. I was wrong," he said, eyes down. Luke placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "You were thirsty. That makes people believe in the wrong things." Samuel looked up, relief softening the lines on his face. "I want to help, however I can." "You already are," Clara said gently, marking his name into the ledger. The sun climbed higher, shadows shrank, and as folks returned to their chores, hauling wood, checking fences, feeding livestock, It was clear something deeper than just the water had been restored. Luke led Storm around the lake's perimeter, his boots pressing into soft earth. Children waved and called his name. A few old-timers, once skeptical, raised their hats in respect. "Hey, Waterkeeper!" someone shouted playfully. The name stuck. He gave a small wave, but kept walking, thinking of his father's voice, low and steady, echoing from some old corner of memory. You don't just fight for your land, you fight for the people who live on it. Near the far side of the lake, Martha sat under a cottonwood tree, her trunk hat beads clicking softly between her fingers. She looked up as Luke passed. "Fairness," she said with a faint smile. "It took its time, but it won in the end." Luke nodded. "It always does, if someone's willing to hold the line long enough." Storm nudged his hand. Luke scratched the horse's jaw and looked out at the lake, the town, and the sky beyond. The fight was over, but something better had begun. There were no more cliffhangers, only the wide horizon and a man ready to ride forward. Sometimes it's not the strongest man who wins the battle, but the one who refuses to give up on what's right. In this story, Luke didn't just fight to protect water. He fought for fairness, for community, and for the kind of future where no one gets left behind. His journey reminds us that when we stand our ground with courage and compassion, even the most powerful forces can be overcome. What would you do if the only thing keeping your family and neighbors alive was threatened? If this story moved you, type number 1 in the comments to let us know. Also, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state. We'd love to connect with you. And hey, if you love stories with heart, truth, and powerful life lessons, subscribe to @Kindness Audio so you never miss a video that speaks to your soul.